Greetings all from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lunapawek, and Arawandurun peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. My name is Brinda Sarathi. I'm a professor of environmental analysis at Pitzer College and currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Western University in Canada. Thank you for logging on and joining us in whatever time zones you find yourselves in. Tonight's webinar culminates a three-part series on race and the environment, sponsored by the American Society for Environmental History and its Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. For curating the series, I would like to acknowledge the labor and support of the American Society of Environmental History Director David Spatz, Associate Professor of History at the University of Cincinnati, Rob Gielli, and Professor of History at Brown University, Nancy Jacobs. This event is also sponsored by Brown City's Initiative for Environmental Humanities, housed in the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, with technical wizardry provided by the intrepid folks from Event and Media Services. While COVID-19 precludes us from meeting in person, I would suggest that the pandemic has also presented opportunities to enhance interaction outside disciplinary homes, fostered equity and inclusion, enabled a strange screen-oriented intimacy, and opened up potential pathways to rethink how we consume resources in the pursuit of professional performance and connectivity. Our panelists tonight will touch on specific historical cases of racialized labor and landscapes in the United States of America. In so doing, they seek to denaturalize the wild, agrarian, and reveal the material and discursive ways in which race, capital, nature, and citizenship have been constitutively produced in the context of a white supremacist and settler colonial state. Please note that Professor Kevin Dawson, who was slated to be our first speaker, is unable to join us today. I'm now going to briefly introduce the panelists. We will then roll directly into some of their pre-recorded presentations, and then the panelists will have some time to engage with each other before we open up the session to audience Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat feature and those will be channeled to me. This event, as with the other two seminars, have been recorded and will be available on the ASA website. So in order, our panelists are Matthew Himel, who graduated in May from Mississippi State University with a PhD in American history. Congratulations, Dr. Himel. He is specialized in environmental history and the history of sport. He is currently a lecturer at Mississippi State University and the social media coordinator for the journal Environmental History. Following Dr. Himel, we'll have Professor Rebecca Johns, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of South Florida. Dr. Johns' research applies material, culture, and rhetorical analysis to environmental education narratives at parks, museums, zoos, and environmental advocacy organizations. Her current work focuses on rhetorical exclusion from environmental discourses based on race, class, and gender, and investigates the relationship between discursive constructs of nature and environmental citizenship. And finally, we have Hannah Raymer, a doctoral candidate in natural resources science and management at the University of Minnesota. Hannah's dissertation research focuses on struggles over urban agriculture and land access in Minneapolis in the 1910s through the 2010s. So now I would like to open the panel and we'll have video recordings. I ask folks to please turn off their cameras, and my apologies for the FaceTime on my end.
Hidden labor at the Village of Pinehurst. golf environment, and middle-class expectations. From 1897, when the first Pinehurst golf course was established, through the 1950s, many have presumed, as Richard Moss points out, that the African Americans were allowed one role in golf, and that was the job of the caddy. While many certainly discouraged Black participation in the sport, historian Lane Dimmis in his book, Game of Privilege, has made clear that African Americans were also professionals, coaches, and even club owners. However, both of these historians, and most others that have analyzed Black connections to the game of golf, have failed to examine the labor used to cultivate, maintain, and manage golf courses. Nowhere is this more paradoxically clear, yet deliberately hidden at Pinehurst Resort, located in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. This region, known for its absence of profitable agriculture in the 19th century, was transformed into a golfer's paradise in the 20th, largely at the hands of African American men and occasionally women and children. I aim to demonstrate that their labor was fundamental to creating what historian Elizabeth Jewett has called a golfscape for white middle-class leisure in the North Carolina Sandhills. Despite their vital role, the resort's white ownership masked Black labor in order to establish a pastoral, unchanging, and natural image of emerald green golf courses devoid of obvious manipulation by Black workers. It is difficult to overstate the aesthetic, agricultural, and environmental transformation that took place on Pinehurst golf courses between 1897 and World War II. The nearly 6,000 acres that Tufts family purchased was little more than a cut-over longleaf pine wasteland. In 1908, the agricultural journal The Southern Planter argued that the lumbermen had robbed the region of the large timber and left only scattered pines and scrub oaks in an area where the sand runs down to China. Warren Manning, the resort's landscape architect and a protege of Frederick Law Olmsted, described the Tufts family's chosen land as a problem of which there were no precedents. Simply put, the Sandhills were not made for growing grass, and agricultural science had not yet developed the techniques and tools needed to overcome that problem. And yet, by 1936, Pinehurst hosted the Professional Golfers Championship with not one but 5 courses blanketed with African Bermuda and Italian ryegrass from tee box to putting green. Pinehurst greenskeeper Frank Maples understood that a keystone of golf's impact on the Sandhills landscape was African American labor. As the resort became more popular, expanded the acreage of turfgrass cultivation, the importance of Black labor only grew. Maples exceeded his payroll budget year after year, hiring more men to tirelessly implement the championed designs of Donald Ross and meet guest expectations conditioned by exaggerated depictions of Pinehurst in resort postcards and advertisements. Black and white images such as this and this depict a landscape that was essentially devoid of all grass. However, the postcards and advertisements that were sent out presented a landscape that was lush with grass and uniformly covered. The prospect of turning the advertisements, a watercolor postcard, into reality took physical work. This is especially true before synthetic fertilizers, specialized equipment, and genetically modified turf grasses. The typical procedure that Maples followed began by contracting workers and mules, known as teams, from the resort's dairy barn for the summer months while the resort was closed. The African-American men with only their first names recorded, men like Mag, Bell, and Joe, first cleared the scrub oaks and brambles. Mules ripped the rotting longleaf stumps from the ground. They then harnessed their horsepower to sculpt the sandy hillsides into bunkers, putting greens, and fairways. An image of this is quite revealing. You can see here the way they're using the mules to actually sculpt the golf course. Often the teams of men and livestock worked in unison, plowing, harrowing, and seeding. After thoroughly clearing the new fairways, several day laborers lined the soon-to-be golf course with temporary fences for the cattle, sheep to directly fertilize the sandhills. Dairy employees managed the livestock, rotating them between fairway pastures and then spread manure. The manure of dairy cattle and mules and sheep and the sweat of African American workers left the recognizable footprint of a golf course on the sandy landscape. As the single course multiplied to 3 and eventually 5 by the late 1920s, Maples needed an increasingly larger crew to cultivate the seeded turf. Cultivation proved to be a decades-long proposition. Men like Tom Clark, an African-American Pinehurst employee during the greatest expansion of golf courses in the 1920s, tended a patchy set of Bermuda and rye fairways. As Maples described in an internally circulated memo, the teams of men and mules were expected to spread 2 cords of manure and 4 cords of moat, then disc composition into the soil. Depending on the time of year, teams would then seed with Bermuda or rye. Use of synthetic fertilizers suggested by the USDA yielded little and cost more. To further complicate matters, stiff competition in Florida caused Pinehurst profit margins to shrink. An article in the American Golfer criticized Pinehurst golf courses and said that they were not what they should be. Essentially, they were lacking grass, and the Tufts ownership and Maples management knew it. The remedy proved to be skilled labor. However, this was not well received by the ownership. In one letter from owner Leonard Tufts insisting that Maples limit his ground crew right down to bedrock, cut down to purely a maintenance force, he said. While the first 18-hole course in 1897 was constructed with only 3 men over 2 months, Maples could see that cultivating and then maintaining 90-hole golf course consisting of hundreds of acres took dozens of men working year-round. Despite insistence from Pinehurst ownership to curtail labor costs, Maples consistently hired more men to collect, spread, and disc larger and larger amounts of manure. On the surface, the task may have seemed uncomplicated. However, skilled labor was needed to handle mule teams and run newly arrived tractors for the cultivation of turf grass, which categorically was different from growing nearby peaches, tobacco, and cotton. Effectively, as more of the Pinehurst land came under cultivation, Maples needed to pay more men a higher wage. This allowed longtime Black employees like Tom Clark to purchase homes in the nearby West Southern Pines, a luxury that few other agricultural laborers or even Black caddies could afford. By the mid-1920s, Maples' insistence on skilled Black labor began to pay off. In 1925, Town and Country reported that the physical advantages of Bermuda grass had enabled Pinehurst to establish an international reputation. Reports like this, along with many others that emphasized the physical advantages, regional climate, or natural conditions, ignored the work of men like Tom Clark and management of Frank Maples. But as turf golf courses covered more of the sandhills, more of the skilled Black labor was needed to spread more manure, broadcast more seed, cut more grass more often. Improving the wasteland meant maintaining those improvements. However, articles in magazines like Town and Country and American Golfer were encouraged to overlook the intensive work needed to cultivate turf grass, especially on golf courses, in the summer and maintain them in the winter. 2 related practices made it possible for the press to overlook the work needed for golf to thrive at Pinehurst. First, the seasonal cultivation of Bermuda grass meant that the majority of work took place between April and September when the resort was closed. Teams of men and mules disced, harrowed, and manured without onlookers. The cattle, sequestered in the dairy barn in the winter, were able to roam freely across the fairways, referred to as cow yards in the summer. When winter problems did arise, such as when an infestation of nutgrass invaded the courses, ownership waited until summer for solutions. Maples was able to hire African American women and children to dig up the invasive species by hand, again while the resort was closed. During the winter, while resort goers enjoyed the fruits of black labor in the form of golf courses, men like Tom Clark quietly spread manure and cut the fairways before dawn. However, summer heat and the darkness of night were not the only ways that black labor was remaining out of sight. The second practice that obscured black labor was on the golf courses can be found in resort payroll ledgers. For example, the Pinehurst Country Club department, which was responsible for overseeing the golf courses, had only 3 employees: the course architect, Donald Ross, the 2 greenskeepers, one of which was Frank Maples. The labor would be contracted from the dairy barn and recorded as team hire. This allowed the resort to maintain careful accounting of expenses, but also mask the work on the golf courses with mixed husbandry agriculture. Both the summer/night work and payroll practices encouraged the golfscape to be separated from the work needed to create it. And in-house advertisements, such as the watercolor postcards, and the independent reporting actively covered up the work of black labor and even management of Frank Maples. Indeed, advertisements and articles emphasized the naturalness of the landscape, architectural designs of Donald Ross, and pastoral leisure. The watercolor postcards presented a landscape needing only a golfer to be complete. One article in 1933 argued that the grass ahead rose to the occasion, insinuating that nature alone was responsible for the Pinehurst golfscape. When work was acknowledged, it was the designs of Donald Ross. A 1936 New York Times article asserted that the craftsmanship of Donald Ross was responsible for the, quote, sketch of ideal golf country. The white, middle, and upper-class golfers that flocked to Pinehurst and other resorts came to expect and even endorse this sentiment. After all, the only interactions they had with African Americans at Pinehurst were with the black caddies who performed an immediate service. Ultimately, hiding Pinehurst golf course labor held a joint effect. First, masking the overwhelmingly black labor undermined the need for manipulation of the environment, thus resulting in the public's expectation that golf courses in the Sandhills and in general were pastoral, unchanging, and natural landscapes. Second, because the golf course labor visible to the public were performative caddies, golfers came to understand the assumed natural golf courses as inherently white spaces not needing the care and attention of skilled black laborers like Tom Clark. Today, these two effects of naturalizing and whitewashing golf courses erased black bodies from the environment itself and African Americans' role as environmental managers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint and get going. Okay, there we go. Sorry, that took a moment. So the project that I'm going to be talking about briefly today is actually a book that's in progress, under contract with the University of Florida Press, and so it's not finished. Just going to share a couple of the main themes with you today. The book, which I call Not Your Grandpa's Sierra Club, is actually called Race, Class, and Nature, Constructing Environmental Citizenship Through the Sierra Club from 1892 to 2020. Just as way of background, I am a geographer by training, and my work is very firmly in the nature society realm of investigation. Much of my work is informed by these kinds of questions from Donna Haraway: what form does love of nature take in a particular historical context, for whom and at what cost? And from Nancy Tuana's article on climate apartheid: to whom are we speaking and for what purpose? Who remains silent or silenced? What lives have been rendered illegible? And so these are exactly the kinds of questions that I'm asking about the way that the Sierra Club has constructed and influenced national discourses about the environment. So the central inquiry of this book is an examination of how the environmental discourses that emerge from the work of the Sierra Club over more than 100 years call into being specific social actors and social events. I'm particularly interested in the way that very definitions of what nature is, where it is, and how humans relate to it embody particular notions of social agency and action, what we might also call environmental citizenship. Now, in trying to understand the narratives of nature and human entanglements, the way that they privilege or reinforce hegemonic cultural values and support long-standing social inequalities, I focus specifically on rhetorics of exclusion and their impact on the way that environmental citizens are embodied. At particular moments in the history of the Sierra Club, I ask, what is this nature? Who is called to act on its behalf? And what are they called to do? How is citizenship imagined and produced? And how does it emerge from the particular ways that nature is itself imagined? How and when do alternative discourses about the environment and about environmental citizenship emerge within the Sierra Club and outside of it? Now, why look at the Sierra Club? Well, as you probably know, the Sierra Club is the second oldest environmental NGO in the US. The Audubon Society is the oldest. Formed in 1892 with John Muir as its first president, it's arguably the most influential environmental organization throughout the 20th century. Many would say that it still holds that distinction today. And inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., it is known as the most progressive environmental group operating today. So without a doubt, it has had a profound influence over national environmental values and discourse. And you can just see over the years it's grown really exponentially. It has nearly 4 million grassroots members today. In terms of methodology, I do apply critical discourse analysis, looking at the ways in which and extent to which social changes are changes in discourse, and the relations between changes in discourse and changes in other elements of social life. So the goal is to identify through linguistic, semiotic, interdiscursive, and ideological analysis the way that texts, which might include visual objects and material objects, are part of the process of social change. And this is arising out of a realist social ontology, in which both abstract social structures and concrete social events are part of social reality. We can obviously talk more about that later if we need to. But part of this work, in terms of looking at social actions and social actors, is by necessity embedded in notions of environmental citizenship. For discourses to mean anything, they have to be operationalized. They have to be turned into strategies for action. And this is exactly what I'm trying to look at, this relationship between discourse and the embodiment of agents and their actions. So there's a number of themes going on in the very rich literature about environmental citizenship that are relevant to this work, just to mention a few of them. The discussion about balancing rights with responsibilities, differences in theoretical paradigms, for example, neoliberal concepts of citizenship versus more radical Republican constructs, issues of the private citizen as consumer versus the public citizen conducting, collective action out in the community. You can actually see some of that in these images here. And issues of participation, of course, in environmental citizenship across diverse socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial populations, right? So just in terms of thinking about citizenship, just one other area that I emphasize is the notion of rhetorical citizenship. So this is the process through which individuals are exercising their rights by engaging in conversations, right? So citizenship is not just about voting, obviously, it's about being part of the conversation. And in this case, the conversation about what nature is, what kind of values we hold in nature, how we should relate to it, what are the environmental problems that we care about, and what kinds of solutions are we going to develop. So rhetorical exclusion is the process through which discourses create specific narrow audiences, embodying their ideas and values to the exclusion of others. And I think we all know that in broad environmental arenas, the groups excluded historically have been, Native peoples, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, and working class white Americans, which are important for this story as well. These are just the objects of research. I won't read these, but you can look at the list, basically reading the thousands and thousands of pages coming out of the Sierra Club over 130 years. So what I want to do actually is just focus on 2 snapshots. That's all I have time for, to illustrate the kind of dramatic changes that are happening here in rhetoric. So we know John Muir, this is John Muir here, as the first president of the Sierra Club, was highly influential in ideas about the environment at the turn of the 19th century. Muir's idea of nature as wilderness, a people-free landscape, a humanless landscape, very sublime, remote. Remember that he was very focused on the High Sierra. This encapsulates what Juan Martinez Allier has called the cult of wilderness. And his prolific writing and eloquence really catapulted the cult of wilderness into dominance in the United States. So this ideal eventually becomes national park policy. And as it's called America's Great Idea, catches on. The National Park Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs together begin to separate Native peoples from their ancestral lands, sometimes with the backing of the U.S. military, for the example in Glacier and Yellowstone National Parks. So this definition of nature excludes from consideration an entire host of others, including Black and Latino Americans, the working poor, Native peoples, who interacted with and conceived of nature quite differently. It also excludes the parallel ideology, the more practical movement of progressive conservation happening at the same time, led by people like Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, who's pictured here, and later amplified by Alva Leopold. That movement does not go away, but it gets eclipsed by the cult of wilderness. For people in positions of social and economic power, the cult of wilderness is an ideology of nature that's easy to slip into. It challenges nothing of one's status and asks little, if anything, in terms of one's material life. It challenges nothing about the structures of production and consumption, which result in poverty and powerlessness for some and privilege for others. Just quickly, these are some visual objects from the early Sierra Bulletin, and you can see how these do encapsulate this idea of this remote, pristine, humanless environment. Here's a few more. We do see people in these early bulletins, but they are always these very middle class or wealthy white men. So the early club, the rhetoric of the club focuses very heavily on rights rather than responsibilities. Campaigns to create trails, curtail roads, protect and create parks. They speak of the rights of state residents to access and enjoy sublime recreational spaces. The emphasis on rights is a consistent theme in the club's narratives, actually going all the way through into the 1990s. But the question is, who are these rights for? And the early club is very much a club, and that its members are powerful, educated white men who come together with a common purpose. At the time of its founding, women could not vote. African Americans had been freed only for less than 40 years. And the massive displacement of Native peoples across the continent was actually still going on. And you just see a couple of quotes here from Muir. We do recognize today that he was quite racist in the way that he viewed Native people, as well as any people of color, really. The early board of directors and members of the club were solely members of the upper class. It was heavily populated by professors from UC Berkeley and from Stanford, including David Starr Jordan, one of the early presidents of Stanford. These were the kinds of men who were involved. And this issue of access is very interesting because they're talking a lot about access, but they mean access for themselves. And they are working actively to keep others out of these parks that they prize so much. And another group that they're working hard to keep out are the cattlemen and sheepmen of the High Sierra. This is a battle that goes on for almost 5 decades. And it's really here that we see the roots of the antagonism between rural people working in extractive industries, whether that's sheep herding, cattle herding, mining, timber industries, farming, and the mainstream environmental movement. And you can see some of Muir's language here. It's ironic because he worked as a sheep herder for a while. But, you know, he talks about marauding shepherds and their hoofed locusts as the Goths and Vandals of the wilderness. And he did advocate for the military to guard the national parks from both indigenous people and from the rural working people with their cattle. and their sheep. So there's a lot that happens in between here, and I don't have time to talk about it, of course. So I'm going to jump to what I call the Millennial Club, which is kind of the end of this story, in order to illustrate these really dramatic changes that happen. And this is an image from a very recent Sierra magazine, and you can see right away the visual nature here. We have an African woman. The kinds of topics that are being discussed are climate justice, gender equity, reproductive rights. So the Sierra Club was influential in shifting the national discourse in the direction of a broader definition of nature and a more inclusive definition of nature citizenship, environmental citizenship. And we can really see this by looking at some of the things that have happened in recent years. What we see is a much more polyphonic discourse and a range of visual discourse that aims to include communities who were once kept on the margins, Black Americans, Native Americans, as well as international communities. And you can see these diverse issues and concerns being reflected here: Indigenous people, No Girl Left Behind, reproductive rights, conversations about capital and consumption, Black Lives Matter. This is just a snapshot of the current leadership of the club, because of course we want to ask that question about discourse and action. That's Michael Brune in the middle, very progressive white male. You can see some diversity here, but 92% of the American environmental movement is still white, the leadership that is. And you can see Carolyn Finney's famous quote, of course, if you don't see yourself, then you know you're not invited. So there's still a lot of work that remains to be done here. But in early 2020, the club came out with a vision that really is radically different from those early years. You can see here the signs and signals that are coming out of this: family sustaining jobs, clean energy economy, healthcare, career transitioning, and that therefore affected workers means those rural communities, working with frontline communities. These are all rhetorical signs that we would never have found in the early club. And this is Michael Brune, talking about justice, about environmental justice and climate justice in January of 2020. This was before the events of the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the movement for Black lives. And what we see after those historic events is the club is one of the first environmental NGOs to come out with a fairly comprehensive statement, trying to position themselves as an anti-racist organization, being willing to confront their very clearly racist and exclusionary history, to grapple with what that has meant and to try to make some substantive changes. At the same time, we can see that they are working to try to hold on to their traditional membership. And you can see that here in terms of some of these images: protecting charismatic megafauna, going on international trips. Quickly, some conclusions. There's a clear shift in rhetoric here. They're influencing a shift in the national environmental discourse. We see a decline of the cult of wilderness and a rise of something new, combining eco-efficiency with environmental justice. It's too soon to say exactly what kinds of strategies and real material changes this rhetoric is going to result in. So we hopefully will learn more about that soon. And that's really all that I have time for. Here are my references, and I am available for questions.
Hi, my name is Hannah Raymer, and I'm a PhD candidate in Natural Resources Science and Management at the University of Minnesota. As someone coming from a different discipline, I'm particularly honored to be a part of this panel and share the story about the entangled roots of the Minneapolis Garden Club and segregation in the city. I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about how I came to this research. I started off my dissertation research entirely focused on contemporary urban garden policy. Activists in Minneapolis have long been working to demand access to land for urban gardens. And the city officials have been generally supportive, at least in word, but have really been struggling with how to make policies that fulfill organizers' demands for racial equity. So with those struggles in mind, I started getting much more interested in looking to the past to shed more light on how we got to this point, and if there were any lessons that might be helpful in navigating these debates. Laura Lawson's groundbreaking history of community gardening in the US really fueled my interest. and especially because she includes a short case study of the Minneapolis Garden Club, which became a jumping off point for my research. Lawson lines of the Garden Club. It was founded in 1910 with the goal of cleaning up vacant lots. Within a few years, it had thousands of members tending vegetables and flowers on hundreds of acres. And I thought, this is great. It's an inspiring story to share with organizers and policymakers, and seemed like an example of participatory city shaping on a massive scale. Digging deeper, this was true in part, but I found a much more complicated story about power, racism, and land speculation. Movement became visible through the real estate men. From the start, the local real estate board provided funds and land, and eventually took over the Garden Club entirely. At precisely the same time, these same real estate men also began inserting racial covenants into property deeds. So I contend that real estate men like Samuel Thorpe, who we'll come back to later, they were using both these tactics, the Garden Club and racial covenants, to impose an order on the landscape that they believed would increase property values. Before diving into that story, I wanted to give a bit of background about Minneapolis up until 1910. Following a series of deeply flawed treaties with Dakota in the first half of the 19th century, white settlement in the area, now called Minneapolis, grew rapidly. This was driven in particular by lumber and flour mills established at St. Anthony Falls, which was the largest waterfall on the upper Mississippi. And the population boomed. So you can see here, for example, in 1880, the population more than triples over the next decade and grows by sixfold by 1910. So in Minneapolis, city leaders were really grappling with this rapid urbanization, as city leaders were in many places across the country. There's a national conversation emerging about concerns about things like pollution, sanitation, disease, waste removal, as well as things like vice or delinquency that supposedly came with city living. At the same time, racial and ethnic others and poor and working class people were often blamed for a whole host of urban and environmental problems, even as they suffered the effects. The urban environment and urban form became seen as a target of reform. Proponents of the City Beautiful movement and urban planning in Minneapolis and nationally proclaimed that bringing order to the urban landscape would cultivate a certain kind of citizen and society. In Minneapolis, during this period, you can see from the map, the city is mostly platted out except for a few areas, especially in the south and north, that are still farms. But even within the areas that have already been subdivided, the rapid haphazard growth left patches of vacant lots, a lot of them overgrown with weeds and strewn with rubbish. The city's leaders regarded these not only as fire hazards, but potential breeding grounds for disease, and also eyesores that were simultaneously symptom and cause of moral decay. Certainly something where there were calls for people to take action to remedy them. Racial covenants were another attempt to impose a particular order on the landscape, this time segregation of the races and white supremacy. So many of you are probably already familiar with covenants, but these are restrictions and property deeds prohibiting certain racialized groups from buying or renting a parcel. They ran with the land, sometimes in perpetuity, meaning that it would apply to future buyers. The first one was recorded in Minneapolis in 1910, and that's where this language comes from here. And they became increasingly common on parcels that were developed after that. This is from Mapping Prejudice Project, based at the University of Minnesota, and they're showing the spread and extent of covenants over time. So here's in 1911, just a few, and 1916, 1921, and 1926. You can see that they spread very rapidly. Shifting gears a little bit to talk more about the Garden Club. So it was started in 1910 with a single vacant lot garden downtown, attended by a boys' club, mostly newsboys and booth blacks. But the club really got going the next year in 1911 as part of a beautification campaign in preparation for a massive civic celebration that was planned for July. The Garden Club got funds from the celebration committee to clean up vacant lots and plant them to gardens. The plan was for the frontage part of each garden to be planted to flowers, and then the back portion would be planted to vegetables. The club also distributed thousands of packets of nasturtium seeds to school children to make the city bloom, making a play on the city's nickname, the Flower City. The way that it worked in terms of membership, the club charged a few dollars and members received several benefits in return. Most important was access to land. The real estate board coordinated a campaign to get members to offer their vacant lots for use at no charge. In return, the gardeners had to agree to vacate the lots within 5 days if requested. Membership also included a variety of seeds and plants, gardening booklets, and a series of gardening lectures. The club grew very quickly in the early years. By 1914, it became the largest civic organization in the city, and it had a substantial footprint in terms of acreage. The Garden Club really saw itself as the marriage of city beautiful and city practical ideals. They thought that neat and tidy gardens would inspire a sense of civic duty, and at the same time, families could use the produce to save or make a little extra money. They promoted gardening as being for rich and poor alike. They were very clear this was not a charitable endeavor. They wanted everyone of all classes to participate. They talked about the benefits of healthy food, healthy exercise, education, and exposure to nature, as well as neighborliness and social cohesion. One article told the story of how neighboring families, American, Norwegian, Jewish, and German families, hadn't known each other, but were brought together by a garden. And as in this 1915 article, the Garden Club celebrated the racial and ethnic diversity of its members. Another article in 1916 wrote that, quote, all nationalities and colors were represented. And now I'd like to turn to the real estate men. The real estate board was a big supporter of the Garden Club. They talked it up in news articles and offered vacant land for gardens and supported the club financially. I'll talk about two characters today, and the first of these is Samuel Thorpe. He was a local real estate magnate and president of the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges. So he had a prominent voice across the country. He was one of the biggest boosters of the Garden Club. He saw his support as a smart business decision, which would bring positive publicity to the profession, and he thought increased property values by beautifying the city. He used his position as president of the NAREE to encourage real estate boards in other cities to begin garden clubs of their own, calling it the Minneapolis Plan or the Minneapolis model. And you can tell how important it was to him personally. These newspaper clippings were from his personal scrapbook. Aside from the publicity, he also supported the club financially. For example, in 1913, his real estate firm purchased almost 300 memberships in the Garden Club to plant fruit trees on house lots on new developments. One of the developments they chose for the planting was the Nokomis Terrace edition in South Minneapolis, in southeastern Minneapolis. So here's a closer view of that area. The Thorpe brothers is in yellow and pink here between the parkway and the creek. Each lot was planted with 6 trees a mix of apple and cherry trees, which were planted by University of Minnesota forestry students, which is actually my home department. So comparing this with the Mapping Prejudice Project maps, you can see that within a year, several of the lots were sold with covenants, and within 10 years, nearly all of them were. And this is significant in particular because it was the first time in Minneapolis that covenants were used wholesale on an entire edition, effectively creating racial zoning. The second character I'd like to talk about is Edmund Walton. He was a local real estate leader, and he was responsible for at least 40 additions to the city. He was also an early supporter of the Garden Club, offering his tenants a discount on their rent equal to Garden Club membership fee. He also served as president of the Garden Club when the real estate board took it over in 1916. And he continued to serve on its board until his death in 1919. Walton also pioneered racial covenants in Minneapolis. Here's an example from a newspaper clipping from a little bit later. So even while the Garden Club publicly touted benefits for all colors and classes, many of its leaders in the real estate industry worked to institutionalize segregation, believing it would provide a more secure investment for their buyers. So in conclusion, the Garden Club was primarily about beautification and civic improvement, as well as neighborliness, education, and saving or making money. And I'm struck by some of the similarities with urban agriculture discourses today. But the Garden Club also offers some cautionary lessons for contemporary policymakers and community organizers. The first is the need to be attentive to the discrepancy between rhetoric and structural conditions. The club proclaimed the enduring importance of garden clubs, but relied on real estate men to offer vacant lots, leading to precarious land tenure. Furthermore, to the degree that the gardens drove higher property values, the gardeners' own labor contributed to this precarity and left the real estate men to capture the surplus value they created. Similarly, the Garden Club publicly celebrated racial diversity of its members, even while many of its leaders created the legal structures to inscribe white supremacy on the landscape. The second lesson that the Garden Club story offers is to be wary of top-down efforts. While access to land surely made it possible for many citizens to directly participate in shaping the landscape in ways that served their material needs and their gustatory and aesthetic tastes, but the transformative potential and sustainability of the Garden Club was circumscribed by the economic interests of its leaders. So it's my hope that these lessons can help us undertake urban agriculture efforts today in ways that build more just and equitable. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I would ask the other panelists to please turn on your videos if you haven't already. Excellent. So thank you so much, Matthew, Rebecca, and Hannah. At this point, I'd like to open it up to you three to first perhaps provide some thoughts on resonances, difference, questions, themes that have come up both in terms of your own presentations and research and connections that you might have seen with the work of your colleagues. And I will moderate that, but why don't we start in order? So Matthew, would you like to begin?
Hi. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you both for those great presentations. I really enjoyed them. One of the things that really stuck out to me in particular was this combination of restricted access and use of the land itself in three similar but still different ways. I really liked Rebecca's idea between the idea of the citizen and the responsibility and the access itself, right? One of the things I thought that was particularly interesting was that the focus on the West with the Sierra Club. I'm sure we've all, or most of us have probably referred or have read the article if John Muir was an agrarian, right? This idea that working landscapes are fundamentally viewed differently during this time period that Rebecca's talking about. And it seems as if that the working landscapes in particular are very similar to what Hannah was discussing as well. And I really thought that the access to the land and the garden clubs in particular, from a racialized standpoint, is really interesting, particularly because at that time period, race is changing quite radically in the United States between 1900 and 1950, that exact time period that you're talking about, Hannah. In particular, that a lot of the ethnic groups that were once seen as not white are becoming more brought into the fold of American whiteness. And you could even say Americanized, where Black and brown people in particular are still seen as others, and the racial covenants become much more racialized than ethnic covenants over time. And so I would be very interested in to see the way that happens, particularly in Minneapolis. Yeah, and so one of the things I really liked about Hannah's in particular was that it brings up this idea of who's allowed to feed themselves, and who has access to land to do that. So yeah, that was very interesting. I'm curious to see what they have to say, if they have any follow-up.
And I would welcome folks to engage with Matthew's comments before moving on to thoughts that Rebecca and Hannah you had. So would you like to respond to his questions, comments, feedback?
Well, they were great comments. Thank you, Matthew. I mean, there's so many overlaps there. I think your point about the way that race was changing is something that I had not actually incorporated into my work, but in listening to Hannah, I saw that you could just, that it's very visual with that list of nationalities. Mm-hmm. And we're thinking, but those are white people. But at the time, of course, they were not considered that. And that's something that I haven't seen coming out in my own work. I haven't looked for it. So I'm now going to pay attention to that. So I thank you. I really thank you both for that.
Were you going to add anything else, or should
No,
I jump in? Okay. Yeah, I agree. The process of Americanizing and the citizenship question. I guess if I had known a little bit more about your presentation, I could have brought out a few more resonances there. That the Garden Club was certainly focused on cultivating a certain kind of citizen. And that citizenship being really tied to the city in particular at first, and then certainly with World War I emerging, becoming more nationalized. And the Garden Club actually ran the War Garden campaign. And so patriotism became very important discourse for the Garden Club. And then sometimes explicitly talked about connecting Italian public city workers with garden land, and joking that they were going to grow spaghetti in their gardens and things like that. So the Garden Club leadership certainly cared about having a diverse or cared about bragging about a diverse ethnic membership. But had a particular vision of what citizenship involved. And Rebecca, I particularly liked your comment about rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and that in tending a garden, that's how people displayed their citizenship in Minneapolis for the Garden Club leaders anyway.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Hannah, were there particular types of vegetables that were promoted generally or specifically? I'm thinking specifically of like different forms of like agrarian traditions. Essentially, like, so I'm thinking specifically of like European agriculture versus indigenous agriculture, in the way that it's indigenous agriculture doesn't typically look tidy in like a European sense. And so your idea that their idea that tidy gardens create good citizens, was there a particular like layout for the garden that was specified?
I'm so glad you asked that. They did publish books and model plans, and they included lectures from horticulture professors, and talked about laying out your rows from east to west and in straight lines. But at the same time, as they kind of promoted a very European-centric, very orderly, very mechanistic kind of approach to gardens. They, in later years, that was especially heavy emphasis in the first couple of years. In later years, they advertised, we don't tell you what to do, we're not going to boss you, as kind of a selling point. So it seemed like they got a little pushback on that and had to modify their messaging. But in terms of the particular crops that they were growing, people could grow whichever crops they wanted, but part of the membership was a predetermined package of seeds of certain varieties, potatoes, tomatoes, cabbage, 3 or 4 different kinds of sweet corn, early, late, and middle season sweet corn, things like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, did you want to comment or engage on any questions of your colleagues?
Sure. Well, one of the things that really struck me in listening to all of our presentations was this active making of invisibility. So it's not that, people of color, Native people, and Black Americans are invisible. It's that they're made invisible. And so in the case of my work, obviously, that's an active removal of people from ancestral lands, a removal of their history from the story of the land. But there's also a connection there in terms of people who are laboring on the land also being, made invisible and marginalized, which I think, flows over and echoes what's happening in Matthew's presentation. With this, the active labor of making a new kind of nature is really what is happening there in the golf course. I mean, there's so much going on there, but at the same time, making the labor invisible, making sure that the people who did the work to transform into this pastoral landscape are not seen. And so in a way, the golf course is almost like a park. I mean, I see a real parallel between the way we constructed national parks as these empty, humanless spaces, which they were not, right? Because nature doesn't have people in it, and it certainly doesn't have brown people in it, right? So the golf course becomes the same thing. It's an artificial human construct, and the only people who access it are white middle-class people, which is exactly the story of the national parks, certainly in the first half of the 20th century. And even today, we know this continues to be a big problem, in fact, right? And then in Hannah's presentation, there's this amazing contrast between the Garden Club trying to promote a kind of multinational, multiracial community, which is actually quite striking, I thought. And then the real estate men coming in and just destroying that by, again, actively making invisible and marginalized these others, right? So this process of pushing people out, it's just really just striking to me that that's kind of what is happening across the board. I also thought that it was interesting in Hannah's presentation to think about, and maybe in all of our areas, to think about change over time, right? So, and Hannah particularly mentioned this as in my work, looking at what is happening today in urban gardens and urban agriculture. So there's kind of two thoughts I have, which one is this bigger question about just farming and agriculture in general, and how it's viewed in national discourse, which has changed dramatically over the 20th and into the 21st century. But more importantly, this revival of community gardens and urban agriculture today. I really liked what Hannah said about this, one of her points, that this top-down method is flawed, because I think in the community garden literature, we see that today as a problem, right? That there's a struggle over, if we're advocating community gardens as an issue, as a food justice issue in food deserts, like in my own community, I do some work on that. It's highly problematic to me, in fact, to present community gardens as a solution for food deserts, but they are often constructed and led by people from outside the community who get a grant and come in, and we're quite excited about having you all grow your own food, but that food doesn't then get to the people who need it. So I was struck by the translatability of some of these points, across our projects, but also over time, over this 100-year period, because we all sort of start out by looking at, kind of the same time period. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Those are really excellent comments, just thinking through these themes of both invisibility and the labor that it takes to actually make invisible. And I just wanted to add to the comment, it really makes me think of Locke and the treatise of like mixing your labor with the earth, but then who actually has been doing that, sort of enslaved peoples in the past, but who actually has ownership and a very particular notion of what even what productive labor is supposed to be, which is an agrarian vision, right? Versus other types of being on the land. Well, quite different with indigenous perspectives. So I just wanted to comment on that, because that really struck me with all of your kind of thinking through one's relationship with the land. So Hannah, I know that there's some things that you might want to respond to in terms of what Rebecca mentioned, or Matthew, or if not, we can move to your comments.
Can I just say one other thing? That you just made me think of something that I wanted to say about Matthew's presentation, which was, while you were talking, Matthew, I was thinking turpentine workers, and I was thinking about how the connection between this kind of very hard labor that you described to create this landscape so that others can use it, and the lack of participation of Black Americans in outdoor sports and activities. And, Carolyn Finney, of course, talks a lot about this, but why would you think of going into the woods, as a recreational activity if your history is embedded in ripping up the land and trying to make sod grow, right? It just really resonated with other instances of that we can think of.
I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. So this is from a chapter in my dissertation that's much longer, obviously, and there's a whole section there about the turpentine industry and basically how the labor is shifted from that industry when there were trees in this area to where, after they clear cut, essentially what those laborers were leveraged to do for this resort for northern white guests who were probably also part of the Sierra Club. And so like the rhetoric that they're using in my sources are strikingly similar to a lot of the same language of John Muir and a lot of these other people that you're talking about out in the West. So it's ultimately very connected. It's quite nice.
Hannah, shall we move on to your comments before moving to audience questions?
Sure, yeah. I think I would just echo what Rebecca and Matthew said about some of the resonances that I was struck by, particularly about thinking about naturalness and nature, where nature is, how nature is constructed. That's certainly in the Minneapolis Garden Club discourse, that the gardens were seen as nature and as a chance to expose particularly city children to nature. And just thinking about how labor was so explicit as part of that. And thinking about kind of the West and different ideas about the West, some school teachers in the Minneapolis Garden Club talked about how getting kids involved in gardening is teaching them to be better stewards of our natural resources in the future. So just thinking about in the Garden Club example that nature included people in people's work, which is so interesting because of a lot of other dominant discourses about nature at the time. But I think the emphasis was about getting kind of poor and working class urban people access to some kind of nature. And then certainly with Matthew's comments about naturalizing a very constructed and labor intensive landscape too. I think maybe I'll just stop there for now to leave time for questions and discussion from our attendees as well.
Great. Thank you so much all. So I'm going to turn to some audience questions. So for the people who are attending, feel free to put your questions into chat and they will be funneled to me. So we have some questions here engaging with both Matthew and Hannah's stories, asking what happens later in the 1950s and 1960s as covenants become perhaps more ineffective and pressure grows to integrate other parts of Southern life and labor. And for example, how did golf courses or garden clubs respond? And a related question that's more specific to Matthew is, have you seen any positive movements, Matthew, in the recent past from the USGA on the issues you've raised? So I'm assuming that's around the invisibilized labor producing these, you know, very beautiful golf courses and the recognition of that. So Hannah, did you want to start with a response and then we'll move to Matthew?
Sure. So the Minneapolis the Minneapolis Garden Club actually winds down in the mid-20s. I think the real estate men kind of lost interest in it as their kind of professional stature grew and Minneapolis became more built out. But in terms of racial segregation on the landscape, even once racial covenants were kind of not legally enforceable, you can see, I don't think I included it on this map, but the areas that have racial covenants were often coded as rated as more desirable on the HOLC maps or the redlining maps. And so you can see the ways that kind of more desirability becomes kind of promulgated through time. And coming back a little bit to the garden clubs and change over time, what's happening right now in Minneapolis is that urban gardening, and especially on publicly owned lots that are vacant, happen on lots that are vacant, and those are disproportionately located in neighborhoods that were redlined historically and are still currently predominantly Black. So there's been continues to be a fraught relationship between race and the racialization of urban space and urban gardening. I'll stop there.
Matthew?
Yeah, so the story of African Americans in golf in the United States is actually pretty interesting, because as covenants and as segregation and racism becomes more and more challenged after World War II, African American participation in the sport, both as laborers and as players, actually decreases in this period. The height of African American participation in the sport per capita is actually before World War II. And there's a bunch of reasons for this that I don't necessarily have time to get into, but one of which is that they have their own separate integrated professional golfers tour, essentially. That's extremely popular at the time and very profitable for a lot of people, including African Americans. But in terms of the labor on the golf courses after World War II, there's a shift between essentially what makes a golf course and the perception of what makes a golf course. Before World War II, it's nature, right? So labor is invisible, labor is deliberately made invisible through these different mechanisms, and nature is seen as the arbiter of the golf course. After World War II, it essentially becomes a process created not just by nature, but also technology and science. And so you have hybridized grasses, synthetic fertilizers, essentially everything that's creating industrialized agriculture for food production is also being implemented on the golf course as well. And instead of that being obscured, it's actually being praised and seen as a way to make the golf course, like your local golf course, look like Augusta National, which for those of you that don't know is where the Masters is held in Augusta. And this becomes really popular after it's televised for the first time in the mid 60s. So at this point, people are able to see it on the screen. And so they essentially accept the idea that we're going to have to change the landscape and we're going to use these specific tools, not people's labor, but we're going to use technology and science. And this is where the agricultural schools come into play, and also the USGA, which is the US Golf Association. In terms of the positive movements, or like a response to racialized landscapes in this way, I haven't really seen much from the US Golf Association on this. It's certainly not in the post-World War II period. Overwhelmingly, the US Golf Association after World War II is really focused on technology and science as a way to improve the landscape, improve the golf course.
Well, here's a question from the audience, somewhat related to that, and perhaps alternative visions for land and labor landscape. So how might we talk or think through, with keeping in mind all three of your papers, about African-American models of what might be a beautiful or useful garden compared to the Minneapolis Garden Club models or conflicting perceptions, and or as they connect to environmental justice and equity models. So I think this really relates to maybe some of the changes we're seeing in the Sierra Club, Rebecca, that are far more recent in relation to, say, food justice landscapes that show up in Monica White's work and in the current municipal food forest project in Atlanta. So I will, how about we start with Rebecca?
Sure. Yeah, well, in terms of African-American ideas about gardens, I can't speak to that, but I think the point that there are multiple visions of what nature is, multiple understandings of what nature is, that maybe that's a garden, maybe that's a park, maybe that's an outdoor recreational activity, or maybe it's an environmental problem that we're defining, that's kind of that is the critical point. And the trying to move the Sierra Club towards a more polyphonic kind of discourse is the act of recognizing that not everyone defines nature or relates to it the same way. And that in my own work, that is the kind of pivotal moment that changes what the Sierra Club does, right? So for the first half of the 20th century, they're focused on preserving beautiful, sublime, empty landscapes for access by a group of people. But that shifts in the 1960s and 70s. It's an interesting process, which we don't have time to go into, but ultimately what happens is what is nature starts to encompass urban nature, and other groups of people's ideas about what matters. Maybe that's clean air or clean water, right? Maybe it's not living next to a landfill. And that opens the door to an environmental organization that can then deal with a whole variety of environmental problems. But I think the critical piece is listening to what people say authentically about their experience with nature. And in trying to address the lack of Black participation in parks and in outdoor activities, the scholars that are working on this, you know, have told some amazing stories. I'm listening to people talk about, well, why don't you want to go, you know, out and go hiking in a park? Because as a white person, I just think that's, you know, like the best thing. And then you start to hear historical narratives about, you know, ancestral memory of working the land under tough conditions, or being deprived on the land, right? And so I think that that's just a critical point that the person is making in terms of being able to listen to what different groups of people think nature is, and how we ought to relate to it, right? And there's different answers to that question, but that's the right question to be asking.
Matthew?
Yeah, so one of the things so one of the things from an African American's perspective, it seems like, in terms of this question at least, is that African Americans, or non-white groups specifically, are unable to see it only from one perspective, right? So white Americans in particular are able to see the golf course from one perspective, as a player, right? Where these ethnic groups that are working on the golf courses in particular are able to see it both, or as a player, as a caddy, and also as a laborer. And so it's, as Rebecca was pointing out, that that essentially African Americans and these other ethnic groups, they're not looking at it in terms of just access for themselves, or seeing it as a separate space, but they're actually seeing it as a working landscape, and as this place that is specifically manicured, and that because it is manicured, it actually takes work to make that happen. So essentially what I've seen is that you can't separate the working landscape from the landscape of leisure, essentially, that they are one and the same. And the way that they're able to see that, based on what I found at Pinehurst in particular, is that they're able to see that because they are on both sides of the coin.
Thanks. And then Hannah, did you want to speak to the environmental justice and equity models around food justice landscapes, whether you see those things as taking root in any way in Minneapolis, or is contrasted to elsewhere? And the person had asked specifically about Atlanta, the Food Forest Project in Atlanta. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I think there has been a lot of energy and a lot of work around and food justice and kind of equity around access to land for urban agriculture. And that's kind of the other half of my dissertation research, looking at more recent policy changes and how city decision makers are trying to grapple with how to implement that. And this was happening even before the George Floyd uprisings. And I think it's been a really big struggle in how to make that happen. I think I alluded to briefly before that there's kind of different distribution of land available that's related to histories of racial discrimination and land ownership and access to land for residential uses as well. But then in terms of accessing publicly owned land, there's certain barriers just in terms of knowing how to navigate bureaucracy and having trust that the bureaucracy will serve you, I think is a major issue. And then there's a pretty substantial Hmong population from Southeast Asia. And so the community planning department that administers the land access program requires a site plan to make sure that there's no nuisance gardens or garden designs that might elicit complaints from neighbors, which was a real barrier to a lot of Hmong farmers. That's just not how they approach gardening in kind of a Eurocentric model of having a site plan developed beforehand. And kind of it's very common for Hmong gardeners to have multiple layers, kind of very sophisticated trellising structures, which can't even be captured in a site plan. So I think that those are some of the barriers and things that the city government is trying to figure out how to adapt to these kind of multiple understandings of what gardening and food sovereignty might look like for different communities.
And I think that just relates to the question and point of like the need to truly like diversify these positions, right? Whether it be policymaking, city councils, planning commissions, to understand the very different perspectives, aesthetics of how land is engaged with and used, that becomes legible in a way that particular plans right now, they don't understand, you know, maybe trellises or particular things. I did want to ask one question, and then I'm going to turn to the final question from the audience member, but this is for Rebecca, and in engaging with the story of the Sierra Club. I wonder in your book, if you're also looking at how the environmental justice movement and sort of grassroots groups are the ones that have forced this change. And certainly that was happening in the early 2000s, right, when they were calling out all the Big 10 environmental organizations. And this statement from the Sierra Club just post Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, one might consider that progressive, but they were really pushed to do that. As a mainstream group, I think we can, celebrate it, Sierra Club is doing it, but they got there by the sort of labor of Black and brown people in frontline communities and fence line communities. So I was curious as to how you're engaging with that element.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'm really glad that you brought that up. So it's a complicated process. That it really starts in the 1980s, this calling out of the Big 10 for racism. And it's just, I think the really critical question is why did it take so long for these organizations to actually make the kinds of statements that most of them made this year? It's kind of ridiculous. I mean, the Sierra Club didn't even have an official environmental justice program until 2000. I mean, that's like late in the game here, because the environmental justice movement was, you know, percolating along and growing from the 80s. So I think you are correct. This is not an internal thing that's happening. And there's actually two environmental movements, right? Many scholars would say it's kind of like environmental apartheid. There's the white Big 10 NGOs, and then there's the environmental justice movement. And they're kind of moving along, and why are they not joined together? And I think that we're only really seeing an attempt to integrate the ideas and the concerns from environmental justice into organizations like the Sierra Club really just now. I mean, in the last maybe 10 years, things have picked up a bit, which is kind of absurd. So I can't say for sure this is exactly the mechanism through which this opening up has happened. It's a combination of increased pressure from grassroots communities and activists. As you're saying, the letters that were written, the calling out of the organization, but it's also shifts in what's actually happening in terms of the growth of the climate emergency and the importance of climate justice. And then there are some things to do with just the makeup of the organization as well. Michael Brune, I'm not one for like heroes, et cetera, but he is a progressive guy, and he's made a lot of waves, and many of the decisions that he's making are actually causing the mainstream supporters to back away from the club. So there's a lot of turmoil there, right? So yeah, I think it's a really good point. I can't really answer your question definitively, but I'm definitely leaning towards, the perspective that you're putting out that this was not something internal, this was something they were forced to do because society is changing and they can't stay on the same path anymore.
Right. Well, I'm going to end with one final question before we wrap up. And this is a really large question. And so I'm going to allow whoever wants to take the first stab at it. And, and I'm just going to read it because it's quite well phrased. Labor and social history have traditionally studied race in specific ways. We can say race has a different trajectory in these histories. Outside the United States, race is also embedded in complex experiences of colonialism and inter-ethnic, interracial relations, often in ways not seen in the United States. So what are some lessons that environmental history as a discipline could take from these multiple labor and social histories? So I know the talks today really focused in the US context, and I think that this person is perhaps asking, how do we think outside of the US context in relation to like larger imperial projects perhaps, and other relationships to land and labor? And this might perhaps just, it doesn't have to necessarily directly relate to your specific bit of research if you just have thoughts on how you might engage with that from the perspective of environmental history as a discipline.
Well, I don't want to keep hogging the microphone. I'll just say something very briefly, which is the international scale is very critical for not for the Sierra Club per se, but for the larger questions about whose ideas about nature get acted upon and who gets to act on behalf of nature. Because of course, there is a very long history of environmental imperialism coming from groups like the Sierra Club and the World Wildlife Fund, et cetera, that have imposed their ideas about environmentalism on countries in the global South, where there are very strong indigenous environmental movements that do not follow the cult of wilderness model, right? India would be a great example, in fact. Great scholars writing about this, Ramachandra Guha, Juan Martinez-Elias. So it's very applicable. Some of these big questions that we're all asking, I think, have great resonance at the global scale. And I'll just let others speak now.
And we have about 1 minute, so feel free to give us your 20 seconds of scintillating thoughts.
Yeah, so the first thing that I thought of particularly was one thing that environmental history can really do really well in terms of this question is demonstrating that race is as constructed as the environment in some ways, and so that essentially people's closeness to the environment or their lack of closeness to the environment, the landscapes that they interact with the most, whether they live on those landscapes, work on those landscapes, play on those landscapes, or go on vacation to these places, that's going to color not only the way in which they see themselves, but also the people that they see while they're there and their respect or lack of respect for those places. And so I think environmental history in a number of ways can reveal a lot of those relationships that I think recent social history has not been able to expose as well.
Hannah, did you want to add anything?
I think that was well put.
Okay, I would also refer the audience to check out the 2 other talks in this 3-part series, because the last session in particular kind of grappled with some of these issues from, I would say, engaging with imperialism as well. And so these are a resource available to a broad audience. And so please take advantage of that. And I wanted to thank everyone for your wonderful presentations, your really thoughtful engagement with each other's works. I look forward to reading your book, Professor Johns. I look forward to celebrating you, Hannah, once you're finished with your dissertation, and wish you well, Matthew, as you embark on the post-dissertation journey. I also want to wish everyone a safe holiday season. Please consider staying in your pod, masking up. There's good news with the vaccine, so we just need to practice some patience. And I send you all my best wishes. Thank you again to William San Martin behind the scenes for channeling the questions. And again, to all the folks at ASA and Brown University Media Services who have made this possible. So I wish you all well and have a good evening, good afternoon, good day. Take care.